Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Robin Carhart-Harris, the famed neuroscientist and researcher at UCSF. I went to San Francisco, and Robin was gracious enough to host me for an interview in his office. It was beautiful, and I just loved getting time with Robin. It was great. So a lot of gold in this one. I think you're going to love it. So go all over the map, kind of Robin's origin story, kind of some stuff on plasticity and other gems as well. The Freudian origins of interest in Grof as well. So, all right, that's it for the intro. Thank you all for tuning in to Psychedelics Today. We will see you on the other side. All right, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here with Robin Carhart-Harris. How are you doing?
I'm good, Joe. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks for being willing to have me record in your office. It's super fun for me.
Yeah, it's a sunny day as well, isn't it?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's been like really weird weather here.
Yeah.
Has it been raining a ton?
Yeah, it's reminded me very much of England, but we're back in California mode now.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And you've been here, we said about 2 years now?
Yeah, just
That's
over
awesome.
2 years, yeah.
And is this part of the Neuroscape Center, or is it part of something slightly different?
There's a little edge away, but
Okay.
we're friends and
Okay.
part of a happy extended family. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, they do some interesting stuff too.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting you're here. And I think what I caught maybe in the rumor mill is there's like more high-end equipment here than perhaps you had access to at Imperial. Is it?
They're pretty hot
comparable?
at Imperial as well. They got a PET MR scanner. Having said that, maybe there's one here. I mean, UCSF's pretty broad and strong, very, very broad and strong in neuro. So it's hard to make the comparison. Both institutions are really top, I would say, yeah.
Amazing. Cool.
But there's fabulous toys here, no doubt.
Yeah, that's awesome. So are you teaching and researching, pure research?
Pure research right now, yeah. It's generally how I prefer it. But I've never done the teaching thing. So, maybe it could work. But yeah, we'll see how things go in the future. There's a possibility there, but probably a little premature to say anything about that.
Right. So I kind of want to rewind the tape before we talk about now. But when did this topic of psychedelics kind of come to your attention in your career?
Oh gosh, in my career or my life?
Either one.
Sure. Well, let's say in my life as a teenager, in the usual kind of way. And then in terms of career, being a student, fascinated by the mind and drawn to depth psychology, just wanting to better understand myself. And then studying psychoanalysis and discovering Stan Grof and realms of the human unconscious. And
did you really start with Freud? Was there something there? Okay.
Yeah. I was just, I was drawn to its sort of transgressive feel. It's like, it's almost like forbidden knowledge or something. So I kind of got off on that. Yeah. And it resonated, I've got to say, had it had felt like junk, I wouldn't have kept going with the psychoanalysis stuff. I mean, some of it really stretches the imagination, but some of it has this very uncanny, which was an essay of Freud's on the uncanny, but it has this uncanny feel like, why is that resonating with me? And so I used that as my kind of, I don't know, bullshit or otherwise detector, truth detector perhaps. Yeah, truth in inverted commas.
How'd you get Grof on your radar?
Why can't we get at this unconscious thing better? That was it. Dreams. Yeah, dreams are cool. Slips of the tongue, free association. What's that really? So that this is all we've got. That's why psychoanalysis is a bit, fringe and not really, considered science. So it was like frustration, really. It was like, I really love this stuff. It's deep and rich and appeals to the blood and guts of the human condition. But like, how can you better prove it? And so it was like, well, if it's real, a drug. I didn't immediately think psychedelics, at least consciously. I was thinking like, when you get drunk and you can become, a bit sort of animalistic and disinhibited. Is that the id? Is that the it?
Mm.
But then it was like, and further along, I got to better understand, the unconscious and how it was way more interesting than, in a sense, popular depictions of the Freudian id as this sort of animalistic, drive-based, instinctive thing. And then, discovering people like Carl Jung and just the vastness of what is meant by the unconscious mind. And then to realize through Stan saying it that psychedelics facilitate access to the unconscious mind, to read it in some depth in Stan's work, and then see how much more there was to it, was a huge, light bulb moment for me, like millions of light bulbs coming on. It was like, that's it. That's what the unconscious is. Yeah.
Makes the horizon really broad,
Yeah.
Stan. So for whatever reason, I'm recalling that there was some interest in finding like neurological correlates or structural correlates to like Freud's structures.
Yeah.
Was there some of that
Yeah,
interest?
there was. Yeah. So I was interested in dreaming, and I was reading people like Alan Hobson writing interesting books on the neuroscience of dreaming and making comparisons between the psychedelic state and the dream state. He wrote this book, kind of popular science book called The Dream Drugstore. I think that was it. And I loved that. And I thought, that has intuitive appeal. And if Freud said, even though Alan Hobson was a Freud basher, he didn't like Freud at all, I could join the dots where, Freud in psychoanalysis says dreams are this, privileged way to get to the unconscious mind. And now I'm seeing that in Stan Grof and others' work on psychedelics, that's a principle of what they do. Well, that's interesting. Maybe both states share neurobiological overlaps. And so maybe that could be a sort of convergence of evidence that these two routes are taking you to a similar place. And maybe we could look at, dynamics in the brain shift in conjunction with dynamics in the mind and begin to make some inroads into the neurobiology of systems that are talked about in psychoanalysis and specifically like Freudian metapsychology, like the ego and its dynamic with the unconscious. So yeah, that was very much a thread, but it's so abstract. I know I'm self-conscious of that as we talk about it, but it was that. So in my school of thought, that's not the problem, that's the opportunity. When something makes sense, but it's abstract, it's like I'm more led by the fact that it makes sense. And, the abstraction is an opportunity. It's a richness, a fertility, and we can really dig into that.
Yeah, what did Freud call dreams? The royal road to the unconscious, I think.
Royal road to an understanding of the unconscious activities of the mind. So we always abridge it a bit, but yeah. So a tool,
And then you start thinking about psychedelics, and it's like, it's so much more available.
Yeah.
Makes the material that much more available, I guess.
Yeah, and it's happening in waking consciousness. You're not asleep. So the access to the material is easier rather than it always having to be this retrospective sort of guesswork that happens with dream reports.
Yeah, like I love Stan's critiques of Freud and Freudian analysis, where it's just like, where's the efficacy? And he dedicated so much time, years really, to this practice. And to what end? Well, thankfully, he was disenfranchised and found psychedelics and really helped pioneer a lot.
Yeah. These people that it's like scaffolding, they're inspirations. I realized that more in time, that you can't expect one individual like Sigmund Freud to have it all down. It was inspiration for the next people that come along. And so it's a kind of evolution of ideas and thoughts. And I guess, it's a lot of Freudian writings and ideas, I do feel still stand the test of time and were way ahead of their time. I actually think there'll be a bit of a full circle with certain psychoanalytic ideas if it's not happening already. I mean, I know the ego isn't a construct owned by psychoanalysis in any way, but maybe more than any other psychological perspective or school, it's psychoanalytic, and that's very much in our parlance now. Especially talking about psychedelics.
So Freud and Grof, were they for you before you decided you wanted to go down this kind of neuroscience path?
Freud was. It was just an innocent intrigue, mostly innocent. Grof, yeah, it's just that was the signpost towards psychedelic research. Very much, that was like, come this way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And how did you personally say, okay, neuroscience is it for me? I'm gonna start doing PhD work or graduate level
Yeah,
work. How'd that go for you?
it's like a timing thing. If neuroscience was where it was when Freud was a neurologist, I can see why he sort of left it to one side in a sense and really flowed with his psychology. But now with the tools that we have, I was just amazed that no one had used fMRI to look in the brain on a psychedelic. That was just absent. We did the first study and
What year was that?
published in 2012.
That's crazy late.
Yeah,
Nice work.
thanks. Yeah, psilocybin, neural correlates to the psychedelic state. And I just thought, "Oh, isn't that an obvious thing?" So there was a lot of naivety, but because of that naivety, I didn't really see barriers so much.
So the regulation wasn't too difficult for you to get through?
It at that time, actually, it was easier than you'd think.
Mm.
It was a combination of having a very solid mentor in David Nutt at the University of Bristol, and his connections and his stature in psychopharmacology meant that when he was in the room with me, they took us very seriously, it seemed. And that helped a great deal. And so we got ethics, and then it all sort of flowed from there. We had some funding from the Beckley Foundation, and it was the right ingredients at the right time. Yeah.
Was it Ben Sesso? I think he was out about being one of the first.
Yeah, he was part of our team. Yeah, sure. Yeah, he was. Yeah, we were the very first dosing we did was Ben.
That's wild.
Yeah. I can say that because he says it.
Yeah,
And
he's out about it.
Yeah, he is out about it. And it was a thrill. Wow. It wasn't very strong, the dose we gave. I think it was just 1.5 milligrams of IV psilocybin.
Mm-hmm.
But everyone was nervous as hell because, we hadn't done this work in the UK for so long. There'd been some IV work in Switzerland. Felix Hassler advised us on how to do things, but was very, very much feeling our way in the dark, really.
Mm-hmm.
So it was thrilling. And I remember moments where David Nutt seemed was sort of teetering on, am I okay with this? But yeah, David dosed Ben, and that was our very first dosing session. Yeah.
That's amazing. Wow. And then things got really loud around you right around that time. You got so much attention, it seems like, which is deserved, obviously. But how did you start deciding what you wanted to look at next?
Well, you're guided by just the harsh reality of the situation, which happened to be, not that harsh, but where are pots of money, and so there's a bit of opportunism. How do we get to do an LSD study? I can't quite remember. Oh, we did crowdfunding to pay for it in the end.
That's wild.
So I had a kind of basic stipend from the Beckley Foundation, keeping me going. That's another thing as a postdoc, it's really just survival, and constantly for many years, it's like, I can't keep this going, can I really? And especially back then when there wasn't the money coming into psychedelics like there is today. So there was that. It was just keep going. We did the crowdfunding to do LSD. Yeah, I really wanted to do an LSD study. Amanda, it was very much a dream for her. I remember not being able to sleep one night, and I switched on the TV, and there was a documentary. It was Brian Cox, a popular science communicator in the UK, talking about the Apollo missions. And they played the clip of Kennedy's speech, and I just still today, it moves me to tears. And I thought, we got to do it. We got to do LSD. So I think that makes a big difference when you have some youthful energy and you get the bit between your teeth and you hammer it, And there was a lot of that early on, and that there was a lot of that with the LSD study, no doubt. Yeah, really made it happen. Had volunteer staff, so it wasn't properly budgeted. We were traveling across the UK into Wales to do the scanning in Cardiff, taking a team from London on the train, doing 4 dosing sessions in 2 days. Very long days, very tiring. But the thrill when you finish it all and you're coming back on the train and you've got, you're deepening this treasure chest of data. It's really thrilling, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's got to be fascinating too, watching from just a small handful of research like this. All of a sudden, there's all this biotech activity. It's got to be a little strange. Do you have any perspectives on that, or it's just a phenomenon that you deal with? Or
it's very much a phenomenon. It's there. It's not, directly in my world. I'm fortunate to just still be focused on doing research and inquiring, asking questions that interest me. I think it's a good thing. It's just it's a little weird. And there is some of that, oh, Johnny come lately kind of thing. When you see people and this topic's new for them and it all seems, kind of funny watching some of that. But more generally, the field is maturing, and there's so many people with a good deep knowledge of the topic. So I think there's a continual maturation process that's happening in the psychedelic space.
Yeah, we had to go quiet for decades, really. And now we're able to be a lot more vocal again, which is nice.
Yeah. I also think some of the weather that's come into the psychedelic space, with some sort of self-reflection and thinking about maybe some mistakes and some of the risks and the dangers. I think it's been really good for the space. I think it's now in our consciousness when previously it wasn't enough in our minds. So that would be an example of the space kind of maturing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, we need those reality checks, and people need to get loud once in a while about problems.
Yeah.
And otherwise, how are we going to learn collectively? You can make
and
your own
be
mistakes.
Resilient as well. Yeah, and all these mega policy changes, they're risky. And so if they're not resilient, then we have a house of cards and it can fall down like it did in the 60s. So, I'm an optimist, and I think this time around we are building a more resilient, carefully thought through approach to things.
Right. Yeah. Thankfully, we have, to a degree, elders this time to, inform us what they went through and maybe help us course correct. And, one difference I think is that this time around, it's really, really hard for the government to bury information and do misinformation in the way they did previously on account of the internet, at the very least. Right. So I feel like there's some resilience there too, in just our technical fabric. But yeah, I'm with you too. Like it definitely some resilient stuff there. So in terms of, I'm kind of interested in what is going on for you these days. What are you mostly interested in, or what are other people doing that's also really interesting for you in the neuroscience landscape?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. I guess front of mind right now is testing the influence of context, otherwise known as set and setting, otherwise known as the therapy and psychedelic therapy. This assumption that it's not just a drug. something I feel very passionate about. I'm a believer. I hold that hypothesis quite strongly, and I really feel it needs to be tested, because if it's not tested and demonstrated, then people start to question it and they think, oh, maybe we can get away with less therapy, or maybe we can develop other drugs that where you can just get the benefit from a drug, and it becomes this, biomedical, biocentrist approach that I would argue is part of the reason why mental health care has been underperforming for so long. So that's that's the excitement for me about psychedelic medicine and therapy, is that it is a paradigm shift, and that's really at the heart of it for me. It's like, oh, this is a really healthy thing for mental health care in its future, where there's this potential to have a treatment paradigm that is more holistic, that is biopsychosocial. And so, what motivates that and really gives it validation is evidence. And, a scientist right in the middle of things, I can say that there isn't enough evidence to really back up our strong assumptions about the role of set and setting and context. It's all sort of indirect evidence. So, I'm always constantly knocking on the door of people and funding bodies to see if they'll support work to test the role of set and setting. So we have a protocol that's on the cusp of approval. We have some decent starter funds to get us going. We'll soon run out of money, but I think, we can get going. And it could be a really foundational study. And so, I can tell people what the design is, because I think it's good to be open like that. There's 4 arms, 2 factors. One of the factors is drug versus placebo, so you could just call it drug if you want. And the other one is set and setting. And so we have 2 levels for that factor. We have an enriched set and setting and an unenriched set and setting. Enriched is what we're used to with psychedelic therapy, with music and good psychological support, psychotherapy, quality psychological support. And the unenriched is taking that away to a basic safety monitoring approach. And the prediction is that when you throw a psychedelic into the works, in this case psilocybin, you exaggerate the influence of set and setting. So you have a bigger difference between enriched and unenriched on your main outcomes, like the quality of the experience you have, the change in mental health outcomes. That difference between enriched and unenriched is bigger when you have a drug that exaggerates its influence. Why does it exaggerate its influence? Because it's pro-plastic. Yeah, that's another component of the definition of plasticity, is sensitivity to environment. Very foundational aspect of what plasticity is. So hopefully people can see how the logic lines up there. So the logic's strong, the theory's strong, but we still got to test it. Yeah.
Yeah, without testing it, what do we have? So I'm curious about the unenriched environment. Is it like you're in a hospital bed, horrible lights, things like that? Or is it like just a really kind of basic, somewhat comfortable white room?
It's more the latter. I don't think we would do the study if, we wouldn't do a study where the unenriched was hostile or adverse. It would offend personal ethics and it wouldn't get past IRB. So it's more, as you find it, a clinical examination room. Yes, the fluorescent lighting might be on if it's as bad as that. Maybe they've got like an artificial plant in the corner and a, taped up picture of, I don't know, whatever, the Golden Gate Bridge or something. But but it could, the point is it could be better. And, you notice when people really put mindfulness to the aesthetic and they lower the lights, and with the music, it doesn't take long and that much effort really before it starts to feel like really caring, like actively caring. And it is an intriguing
Mm.
thing to think that that's absent in the default, you know? That's a thing that a colleague said to me once, that she loved the fact that psychedelic therapy brought back care. As someone who went into the mental health care profession, she felt like she could care again, for the first time in a long time. And that was not just okay, that was really, promoted and made easier in a sense by the paradigm.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of clinicians are in a tough bind with how they
Yes.
have to operate.
Yeah, it's rough. It's management in a sense.
Yeah, it's not a great scene, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And I love that we can be a tip of the spear, like showing that.
Mm.
It's interesting.
And it's idealistic, but what is there if we're not, striving for better and improvements? So yeah, idealism should lead us really.
So you mentioned plasticity. This is like a often brought up topic. How how do you like to describe it
Mm.
to a lay audience?
Yeah. Yeah, often discuss it, often misunderstood. And I like to describe it by going to the dictionary in a sense and saying, look, this is what it says. And for people listening, they might want to do that, even if it's just a quick Google, and it will say something like plasticity is the ability to be shaped or molded, or malleability or changeability. So plasticity is often misunderstood or almost co-opted. And, I think mental health research and neuroscience should shoulder some of the blame for this, that they co-opt it to mean actual change. So like end phase change, and usually a change in the brain. So that might be synaptogenesis is a classic one. Like, oh, now we have new growing bits on neurons. That's really the end phase of a plastic process, and it's anatomical brain change. But is that plasticity, if plasticity is defined as changeability? Well, it could be the result of increased changeability. It could give you conditions for psychological plasticity. And that's a term that I feel is sort of, I'm surprised it hasn't been used more, because in biology you have something called phenotypic plasticity, and that's very close to the dictionary definition of plasticity. The ability to be shaped or molded is very close to the principle that plasticity is the sensitivity of something to the environment. As the environment changes, it induces change in some property of an organism. The term is phenotypic plasticity. So, some feature, some trait, some property of an organism being sensitive to changing environmental conditions is an example of phenotypic plasticity. And it's also an example of changeability. So it fits. And psychological plasticity is kind of what we're interested in with psychedelics, because we're interested in how people change, how to change your mind. And but when plasticity is co-opted to mean often Hebbian plasticity, I'm getting quite specific here, but principle of cells who that are proximal to each other, close to each other, having activity that's synchronous, they strengthen their connections. That's Hebbian plasticity, and we often, use that as a way to understand learning. But it's just one flavor of plasticity. Is very specific. And I guess my point is that plasticity is actually a really fundamental, basic thing that transcends the particular measures or metrics that we have. And we've kind of got lost in popular metrics to think those metrics then become plasticity. And yeah, so you know, there are other things that happen in the brain that we see under psychedelics that it's transpiring are very good predictors as well as correlates of changes in psychological plasticity or changes in one's psychology. So they're markers or indices of psychological plasticity. And they're quite different to things like synaptogenesis. They might relate to it, but I don't see too many animal researchers wanting to join the dots there, which is unfortunate. But in humans, there are things that we can measure with functional brain imaging that it's transpiring are quite strongly predictive of downstream changes in one's psychology and more specifically one's mental health. So I could be a bit even more specific and explicit and say this thing that I call the entropic brain effect. So when you measure, and it works best if you measure the electrical activity either through EEG, which is the sort of most available modality, or something called MEG, which is like super EEG in a sense. But anyway, you're recording brain activity across time, you give a psychedelic, and you see the entropy or the complexity or the diversity of the ongoing brain activity go up. And it goes up very reliably, and it tracks with the intensity of the trip. And what we're seeing now is that the magnitude of that effect is predictive of changes in mental health outcomes, like up to 1 month later. So really excited about that, but also reflecting on it, thinking, oh, is it as simple as a big entropic brain effect is going to be really good for your mental health? Well, no, it's not. I think what's more likely is that it's an index of plasticity, in the middle of a plastic process. It's indexing plasticity, like changeability, malleability. And because when we give the drug and we give it in a positive environment with the music, with psychological support, that's harnessing the plasticity and guiding it in the positive direction that it goes in. So that's the interpretation of that result, But it's exciting, and the biocentrically minded people might see it and think, oh, that's the biomarker. That's all you need. You just have your big entropic brain effect, and hey presto, you know that this person's going to have an improvement in their mental health downstream. But, that doesn't appeal to my intuitions on this. And I think it's a really exciting possibility that it's going to become like candidate number one as a marker of plasticity and the pro-plastic effects of psychedelics.
Is there a substantial difference in the term critical period reopening?
There's a subtle difference. So critical period reopening is referring to a window of time, typically in early development, where the development of some phenotype is especially strong, and that window, is the period where learning or the processes of development are especially important, such that if that window of time closes, the opportunity has closed for the development or the learning. So critical periods are quite specific. It should always follow that you have to answer critical period for what. And so if it becomes very generalized, like critical periods for everything, it just to me sounds a lot like generalized plasticity. And so I prefer, it's like a toothbrush problem, Others, Gould-Dolan and others would go with reopening critical periods. I would just say, critical periods for what? If it's everything, then isn't it critical period plasticity, or do we really need critical period there? Mm-hmm. Or is plasticity more foundational, more basic, simpler? So they're closely related, but also different. And because of the co-option of plasticity as defined in the dictionary and understood in biology generally to mean phenotypic plasticity, the ability to be shaped or molded, or sensitivity to the environment, because we've become so wedded to certain metrics, and specifically neuroscience measures of plasticity, like long-term potentiation or synaptogenesis, then if the drug doesn't directly do that or tune something else, there's a tendency to want to call the drug a metaplastic agent, I don't know. I'm lukewarm on that. I can sort of see it if the drug is an effector molecule starting a cascade, But then somewhere along the process, you would want to be able to say that something specific is the plastic agent. And it's not clear to me that that really carries so much value. So again, appealing to simplicity, I prefer plasticity, but I'm very specific, as you can see, about my definition of it. And I just say go back to basics. Look it up in a dictionary, and that's what guides me. The ability to be shaped or molded is our definition of plasticity. So changeability, malleability.
That's great. So this feels like a fun transition into the pain topic, if you're interested in chatting about that for a minute. So pain is often misunderstood, even sometimes by physicians. And it's like this whole new understanding of this plastic pain, how, plasticity could be exploited, I guess, to help treat pain conditions. What kind of stuff have you heard about pain, or how do you understand pain in this kind of way that psychedelics might be able to intervene?
Well, so I'm not a pain expert, but I've learned on the job. It's usually the case. And bringing in people who are pain experts, like physiotherapists, James Close into the team, anaesthetist, Kieran Ahmed, and then working with other, psychologically minded pain experts. Also having a bright PhD student, Julia Borman. So there's been a realization in me that there are quite distinct types of pain. And the more focal pains, like a classic one, say lower back pain, is probably quite distinct from a generalized pain like fibromyalgia syndrome. And maybe that nociplastic pain it sort of fits more with the fibro space, where it's unclear sort of physically where the focus of the pain is, and if it even has a focus as such. And so, the origin of the pain is hard to disentangle. A chronic lower back pain, is often, it can be triggered by an injury. Maybe there's been some surgery, and that's, added complexity and a focus to the problem. Whereas the generalized, you start wondering, as many people do, well, has this come from something in terms of experience, stress, trauma? How has it transferred, in a sense, from one's mind, which isn't distinct from one's body, but we often go there and do that, but has somehow transferred from experience into being embodied. And so it has that kind of, they sort of call it, what's the term, sort of a functional origin. And I think, I guess you favor and are biased by your own experiences. So we have done a fibro trial now. We've finished it, at least the main dosing part, the team at Imperial. And it's gone very well. So there has been a thought among the team that, fibromyalgia syndrome, that's a perfect subtype of pain for psychedelic therapy, because the psychedelic therapy is going to work on in a sense, the psychological aspect of the pain, how you identify with it. I mean, if it was to work really well, maybe unravel the etiology or the pathophysiology from the mind, from the experience, from a trauma, say, into the body. If that can unravel under a psychedelic and then be worked through, then maybe that process could even be, in an ideal scenario, sort of let go of, or digested, or worked through and somewhat let go of, which has happened. I mean, people have been pain free in that trial for a sustained period after the treatment, even it's just one big dose of psilocybin. So I'm really excited and pleased that we went with chronic pain and specifically that type of pain. Other types of pain that might sort of fit the theory might be things like phantom limb pain. Again, it has a kind of functional origin. Sure, you've lost a limb, but, your mind and your brain still registers the existence of the limb. So the limb still exists in your mind. And so that's a thing to process and, in a sense, let go of. And it very much appeals to, this model of the way the mind and the brain works, which is predictive, that we see the world and experience the world through our predictive models, otherwise known as our assumptions or our beliefs. And, those beliefs can be quite low level, like I've got a leg that has a foot and it ends over there somewhere. Or it could be, I believe in the Holy Roman Catholic Church or something. It's giving away my upbringing. And so, there's different hierarchical levels to these assumptions. But the assumptions are often the problem. I mean, they guide our experience of the world, but they can entrench us in certain ways. And that entrenchment can be really at the heart of a lot of psychopathology, a lot of mental illness. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And yeah, I'm close with the cluster buster people now. They're a fascinating group, and they resist for good reason sometimes, the idea that there's like depth material that they might have to work through in order to resolve their stuff. Because it's interesting. They just, throw mushrooms in, and often they're pain-free in an hour or something, probably a little less. Yeah. And then that can like move those weird neurological attacks away for a few months, perhaps. And it's interesting, like no therapist in the room. This is a whole debate with like how medicalization will happen too. Like there's potential impact with the MAPS process with FDA that could impact that research by requiring physicians and people in the room for dosing when these people have been taking care of themselves quite well for a few years, under-resourced for sure, but doing it okay. And it's an interesting debate. But I agree, like by having that much suffering, you're going to accrue depth material that you have to work through eventually.
Right. Yeah. And, I think cluster headaches are a good example where it challenges the model and perhaps doesn't fit the model. So, the models guided me in the different disorders that we chose, at least after the depression work. We went to anorexia. And where you can, I think, make a strong case that there's a strong influence from assumptions and beliefs in that case, maybe about one's body, one's self-image, one's sense of self more generally, and how...
The results in anorexia were pretty good, right? And
yeah, they are, yeah. And that's a work in progress. The team are writing that up, but the dosing is complete. But out at 3 months, 60% remission, at meaning patients no longer meet the formal sort of threshold for having anorexia. And this is adult, later life anorexia, so kind of atypical in that sense. Most anorexias in younger women.
And for listeners, this is like one of the most difficult to treat disorders. It's like really dangerous.
It's the most deadly psychiatric disorder, and tragically so, taking far too many young lives. And so, and then very difficult to treat. And people have characterized it as having some overlap with addictive disorders, even though it's not, taking something, it's sort of restricting something, caloric intake, but that carries the reward. And so it gets entrenched through that sort of omission in a sense. It's still a kind of action, even though it's holding back. So, it very much fits, in my mind, the model of an entrenchment, a learning process that's gone awry. In fact, Hebbian learning that's gone awry, which has an irony there because Hebbian learning and Hebbian plasticity is a favorite marker of neuroplasticity. So there you can see how an intervention, psychedelic therapy, where the psychedelic promotes plasticity, is actually working on the mirror opposite, the inverse of a plastic process in terms of Hebbian plasticity. So then you realize, in a sense, how problematic it is if we see something like Hebbian plasticity as like, the one and only way to index, or like, the gold standard way to index plasticity. It's not. Plasticity is way more fundamental than that. So So yeah, you think, anorexia, fibro, depression, so many disorders, addictions, a lot of image disorder, specific anxieties, social anxiety even, and maybe generalized when it becomes there's still a habit component because there's the fear of feeling anxious. So there's the anxiety of anxiety, and that's kind of learned. So it becomes hard to find the exception. Even in psychosis, you have delusions that have a degree of learning, I think, and fixation. So even there, it's like, well, that kind of fits this thing too. This entrenchment, I call it canalization, and then I say psychedelics, are potentially so effective because they are the just the solution you want if you have runaway heavier mechanisms or runaway associative learning. You have this entrenchment, this routinization is a term I've heard recently. You're rooted in a particular way, and that becomes really, the very sort of, nucleus of the problem. And so to break things open and promote a generalized plasticity, it makes logical sense that that would be the beginning of a solution. Yeah.
Yeah. So beyond testing different types of contexts for sessions, set and setting, et cetera, like what else is really interesting to you these days around psychedelics?
Yeah. I guess part of it is like wanting to crack into where there's real, genuine mystery, where we really don't know, and it still feels like we're feeling our way in the dark. Because kind of the therapeutic potential cat is out of the bag. Thankfully, everyone's kind of got into that game, and things are really moving well. And so, I in a sense, I could contribute less there. And so I'm being very mechanistically minded, I'm thinking about the importance of demonstrating how this works. And in better understanding how something works, you can refine the treatment and make it better, not just more effective, but also safer because your intervention is more like on target. So that's kind of abstract, but yeah, I'm doing imaging work currently, doing fMRI and EEG, very deep recordings within subjects. So rather than trying to do a big sample, which is always difficult anyway and expensive, trying to go deep within a small number of individuals. And in that way, look at some of their own dynamics and better understand some of the nuances in trips. And so that's something that we're doing right now. We're dosing someone tomorrow for that work. I do
What kind
feel
of substances are you using for this one?
it's still psilocybin, and I am interested in other substances. Yeah, I'm very interested in 5-MeO. Really, as much as anything, as a consciousness probe, because it seems different to the others, to a lot of other psychedelics, at least the usual contender like tryptamine, classic psychedelics.
It's crazy how different it is.
Really?
Yeah. Just it's so I've heard people call it barely it barely fits in the category of psychedelic just because it's so like different subjectively. Which blows my mind because it's just a little different from regular DMT, if we want to call it that.
Yeah. That is a difference that makes a difference, and that phenomenological subjective difference has got a map to a neurodynamic difference, and that really excites me, is finding what's different in the brain. I've got a few ideas about what it might be. Yeah, well, I can go there. I mean,
yeah, let's go there. Like,
sure.
What are you speculating? Like, for what it's worth, Stan Grof and his current wife Brigitte are very interested in 5-MeO DMT, and they're probably some of the more responsible people looking into it.
Right.
Which is interesting to me. I've only had it once in a really interesting context at somewhat lower doses, but yeah, what are you kind of speculating?
Yeah, I think it's the aspect of the phenomenology where it loses granularity in a sense. and becomes oneness. And it seems some people lack a memory of what happened. They might even say it's sort of contentless, but contentless in a way that's different to, say, a blackout with an anesthetic. And so, it's those differences that really intrigue me. So I wonder whether, the entropic brain effect, which in my mind, with the privileged access to data that I have, a lot of which is unpublished but will be published soon, I can see how reliable that metric is, specifically a metric we apply to EEG or MEG data, just so reliably tracks with the intensity of a trip. But there's this question of when, usually the rule goes like this. This effect, the entropic brain effect, as I call it, which is an index of the entropy or the unpredictability of ongoing brain activity. If it's, all over the place, it's hard to predict. It's lacking any structure or any regularity. And that, I say, is an index of the richness of content of conscious experience. You could also call it the richness of phenomenal consciousness. So experiential, like pure experiential consciousness. However, what happens with 5 is it challenges that principle. It's almost like it tops out. And the brain activity, this is my hunch, the brain activity is so entropic that it's transcended any regularity. It's like white noise. It's like pure chaos. There's no structure there. And at least at peak with a high dose, and then you come back and form starts to come back and regularity starts to come back, and maybe some insights happen when you re-find your mind and stuff, and then eventually yourself. And so I think it's like a topping out of the entropic brain principle into a space where it sort of transcended any regularities in the activity. And there's regularities in activity is just ubiquitous in brain function and anatomy. Like it's organized, and it's organized hierarchically. That's another thing. So that's another part of this picture, is that hierarchical organization collapses. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Hmm. I've heard speculation that effectively comms between the networks are effectively going offline, and the chaos could contribute to that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So you see that this could help flesh out some of the. Are you still calling it the Rebus model when you work with it?
Yeah. So the Rebus
Mhm.
model was like an evolution of the entropic brain principle, hypothesis, and specifically applied to, predictive mechanisms of how the brain and mind works. At which Rebus stands for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. So it's speaking to how the strength of one's assumptions, one's beliefs, one's internal predictive models weakens, goes down under psychedelics. So it's very, very consistent. It's just, in a sense, another angle to look at, in a sense, the same thing. It's very consistent with the entropic brain principle.
I was talking to a friend last night, and we have all these ways of doing interventions, from mechanical, for lack of a better word, tools like STIM, TES, TMS, things like along those lines. We have drug interventions, and we have tools like EMDR, et cetera, to like manipulate whatever's going on there. And the drugs are just so interesting, predictable. You can just administer 5 milligrams, and you have the data from 5
Predictably
milligrams.
unpredictable in a sense. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's just so much room left here. Like we're kind of in a scientific black hole still, digging our way out of decades of lack of research, which is tragic. But we're getting there. And I'm optimistic on the drug train for us understanding the brain a lot more. For instance, I was talking to Paul Daly a couple hours ago over at the Shulgin farm, and talking about actually, this was with Shulgin, Anne Shulgin's daughter, Wendy. But like 2CI, for instance, just manipulating hearing or something. Like how there's very similar structurally, similar drugs, but doing wildly different things. And we haven't even probably put those drugs under imaging yet to see what's
so
going
much
on
to
there.
do. Mescaline as well. Very little work on that. In fact, the first human brain imaging study ever that wasn't just EEG was with mescaline by a German researcher. It's often overlooked. You know, people think, I mean, there were great pioneers in Rick Strassman, Franz Vollenweider, but it was a German team that did the first human brain imaging study with mescaline.
Early 2000s, maybe?
No, this goes back to like, was it even late 80s?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's surprisingly early. It might be 91 or something. Yeah, I should be able to tell you who the first author is, but I can't right now.
Yeah, all good. All good. The German studies are important.
Yeah.
And and to give them a little credit, I think post World War I, they had the first mescaline study for phantom limb pain in the really early days. It seemed to work pretty well. And then they did it again in Japan, the Kuromaru study, but I think it was LSD with phantom limb pain in the 50s, perhaps. I wish I knew the German ones, but easy enough to find. But yeah, psychedelic research has been going on forever.
Well, it has. You know, another surprising thing perhaps is that there was so much Italian research in the 50s and 60s.
I know zero about Italian research.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I think maybe they were the most productive.
Wow.
Of like any nation. There's some mad stat like that. And like, you know, how many studies can you name from these Italian researchers?
That's really interesting. And we
Yeah.
don't have any, like the scene has no real knowledge of that. So
yeah, and the
that's something we gotta
politics as
do.
well now, if you think, you know, there's, to my knowledge, really not much, if anything, happening in Italy with psychedelics.
I've heard of nothing.
Yeah, probably quite anti-drug culturally, I think, at least now. So it's funny how it shifts.
Yeah, well, thankfully we have a big enough world for a lot of people to pick it up and keep running. And now you're in San Francisco doing it, and kind of like a major cultural hub for
It's
this
amazing.
stuff. Yeah. Do you ever get insights from the community around, other areas to investigate? So community meaning like people outside of the academy.
Outside of the Academy of Science sort of thing.
Right. So just like not like university employees or like full-time researchers or things like that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's hard to name something concrete, but there's a lot of sort of implicit things moving me here and there. Stuff that's come up. I mean, one thing that's entering my mind is the recidivism thing, you know, and thinking about having my position in Ralph Metzner's name and thinking of like the Concord prison experiment. I think there were learnings there because it didn't work that well as far as I can remember, but you know,
a little bit of lack of rigor, but
right? Yeah,
they could have done it better, and then we can do it better, hopefully.
Well, there you go, and that's part of the learning. So, yeah, I mean, yes, I do listen and watch. I guess one thing I've discovered, which is fantastic here, is just seeing how broad the community is here around psychedelics, and generationally as well. Like, you know, in London, it was really just a young generation, but here it really transcends generations, and I really appreciate that. And there's something very normalized about psychedelics here that I started noticing very early on, that it was a topic of like polite conversation, you know, with sort of parents at the school gate. It was very easy for it to come up, and that was nice. That felt like a glimpse of how it will be, not just here, but elsewhere in the future. Yeah.
Couple more decades.
Yeah.
Y'all are ahead of the curve here for sure, historically and otherwise. It's interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, that multi-generational thing is unbelievable too. Like everywhere from 90-year-olds to 16-year-olds. So hopefully not much younger than that. Yeah, it's fascinating. And so much wisdom too, because they've made a lot of mistakes and they shared about it.
Yeah. Interestingly, they also bring up, you know, a lot of, not just the mistakes, but I don't think that's just a defensiveness, but like, you know, kind of the good that came from, like, say, hippie culture in the 60s, you know. It's like that bumper sticker, you know, the hippies were right. Oh, yeah, they were actually. Not about everything, perhaps. About a lot. Yeah,
exactly.
Peace and love. It's hard to...
That's a good start.
Yeah,
right.
argue against.
Did you get a copy of I forget his name, this dude Rupert, The Art of Ecstasy. He did this art book about English ecstasy culture. Beautiful photography, and he like had all sorts of interesting stories included as well. It's a big, thick art book.
I'd love to see
I'll try
that.
to have him send you a copy.
That'd be
It's
fab.
beautiful. And his suggestion was like in England before ecstasy really hit, it was like really the hooligan culture was just outrageous, so much violence and fighting, and then like kind of, I'm sure he's exaggerating a bit here, but ecstasy showed up, and then all of a sudden everybody from all the teams was all in the same nightclub.
Hugging. And
2 years before they were fighting, and now they're having the best time in the club. And like, what a interesting cultural transformation.
Yes, the power, the causal power. I mean, it's almost frightening. The strength of the causal power of a drug.
Deep alcohol versus deep MDMA.
Of course, it's not just a drug. I mean, there was the music. You sort of have, punk and sort of anger and political things happening in the UK, 70s, 80s. But there was a brightness and like a new spring that did seem to coincide with MDMA coming on the scene.
Yeah, and I think, not just MDMA, right? It was like the context again, like we're dancing similarly, listening to the same music, deepening trust that way.
Yeah.
Kind of hitting a lot of like hive triggers, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's complex causal process. Circular causality or something.
Super, super interesting. So I think that's it for now, but how can people follow you?
Yeah, I got a website finally.
Good.
Carhart-Harris.com.
Oh, really? Yeah. Great. Awesome.
Yeah, it's just young and developing, but it's there. So that's
great.
Nice.
And that's the best spot?
I think so. And Twitter as well, for my sins, as people say. I use that terrible thing.
It's going to be interesting to see how that develops for academics. I think there's so much just inertia there for, how do you escape?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's my excuse, is that it's just, that's how I keep my finger on the pulse almost, is I so many new papers and so on are coming up because of my Twitter feed. Yeah, that's my excuse.
Yeah, there it is. Perfect. Well, Robin, thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks. And there you have it, everybody. Robin Carhart-Harris. Hope you enjoyed this one. I sure did. I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your day. And if anybody you think would enjoy this one, please share it. Please, please, please share it with some friends and family, researchers, whoever. Robin is one of the top minds in the psychedelic space, and just really appreciate his insights. All right, that's it for now. Thank you all for tuning in to Psychedelics Today. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.